On the morning of May 10, 1940, in a quiet command post at the Château de Vincennes, east of Paris, General Maurice Gamelin received the message he had spent years preparing for and yet had never truly imagined would arrive this way. German forces had crossed into the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. The long-expected war in the West had begun. Gamelin, commander-in-chief of French forces, was 67 years old, deeply respected for his service in the First World War, and firmly convinced that the coming campaign would unfold according to plans refined over decades. Within 6 weeks, France would cease to exist as a fighting power, not because it lacked soldiers, weapons, or courage, but because the structure of its military thinking, its political fractures, and its misreading of a new kind of war left it unable to adapt once events escaped control. France entered the Second World War with reasons for confidence. In 1939, it possessed the largest army in Europe, mobilizing approximately 5 million men. Its fortifications along the German border, the Maginot Line, represented the most extensive defensive system ever constructed, stretching from Switzerland to Luxembourg and absorbing enormous financial and political capital. French tanks, such as the Char B-1 bis and the Sommua S-35, were heavily armored and often superior in firepower to their German counterparts. French artillery doctrine, refined through the trauma of 1914 to 1918, emphasized control, precision, and overwhelming fire. On paper, France was not a weak power confronting an unstoppable enemy. The defeat of 1940 was therefore not inevitable. It was the result of decisions made over decades, hardened assumptions, and a system unable to respond once those assumptions collapsed. The trauma of the First World War shaped everything that followed. Between 1914 and 1918, France lost approximately 1.4 million soldiers killed and another 4 million wounded. Entire regions were devastated. A generation of officers internalized the belief that modern war was fundamentally defensive, that firepower dominated movement, and that survival depended on holding ground methodically. After the war, French strategy aimed to avoid another bloodletting by trading time and space for security. The Maginot Line was not merely a wall of concrete and steel. It was the physical expression of a strategic culture that valued certainty over improvisation. It assumed that Germany, once again, would attack directly across the Franco-German border, where French defenses were strongest, and that France could mobilize fully before engaging in decisive operations. This assumption drove the Dial Plan, the operational blueprint that Gamelin activated on May 10, 1940. Under this plan, French and British forces would advance rapidly into Belgium to meet the German army, establishing a defensive line along the River Dial. It was a rational plan given the intelligence available, consistent with German behavior in 1914, and politically necessary to protect Belgian territory. What it did not account for was the possibility that the main German effort would not come through Belgium's central plains but through the Ardennes forest, a region French planners considered unsuitable for large-scale armored operations. The belief that the Ardennes was impassable to tanks was not based on ignorance, but on outdated experience. French exercises in the interwar period had shown that moving heavy units through the dense forests, narrow roads, and steep valleys of the Ardennes was slow and vulnerable. French doctrine assumed that any such movement would be easily detected and disrupted by air power and artillery. As a result, the sector was defended by second-rate divisions, many composed of older reservists with limited training and inadequate anti-tank weapons. These units were expected to delay, not to stop, any advance. Crucially, no significant operational reserve was positioned behind them. The German plan, known as Fall Gelb, exploited this vulnerability with precision. Developed largely by General Erich von Manstein and adopted after internal debate within the German High Command, it envisioned a feint into Belgium to draw Allied forces northward, while the main armored thrust pushed through the Ardennes, crossed the Meuse River near Sedan, and drove rapidly toward the English Channel. This was not an act of reckless audacity, but a calculated risk grounded in Germany's evolving doctrine of combined arms warfare. German panzer divisions integrated tanks, motorized infantry, artillery, engineers, and air support into a single operational system designed to penetrate defenses and exploit speed before the enemy could react. On May 12th and 13, German forces reached the Meuse. At Sedan, French defenses were thin, their artillery poorly coordinated, and their air support minimal. German aircraft, particularly Ju-87 dive bombers, conducted sustained attacks not to destroy fortifications, but to paralyze defenders psychologically and disrupt command and control. French units, already strained by fatigue and poor communications, began to break. On May 14th, German forces established a bridgehead across the river. That evening, French commanders at Sedan reported that their positions were collapsing. The response from higher headquarters was slow and fragmented. Orders passed through multiple layers of command, often by telephone or courier, while German units moved continuously. Gamelin's headquarters lacked the tools to manage a fast-moving crisis. French command doctrine emphasized centralized control, requiring approval from senior officers for major movements. There was no equivalent to the German concept of Auftragstaktik, which encouraged subordinate commanders to act independently in pursuit of broad objectives. As reports from Sedan grew more alarming, French leaders struggled to comprehend the scale of the breakthrough. On May 15th, Prime Minister Paul Reynaud informed Winston Churchill by telephone that "we are defeated." It was not hyperbole. The German armored columns were already advancing westward at a pace no French plan had anticipated. One figure who grasped the nature of the crisis was Colonel Charles de Gaulle. Commanding the newly formed 4th Armored Division, de Gaulle attempted limited counterattacks near Montcornet and later at Abbeville. These actions demonstrated that French tanks, when concentrated and properly led, could challenge German armor. But they were too small, too late, and unsupported by a broader operational framework. French armored units were dispersed among infantry formations, used as mobile pillboxes rather than as decisive instruments. De Gaulle's ideas about armored warfare had been marginalized in the interwar period, and in 1940, there was no institutional mechanism to translate his local successes into strategic recovery. As German forces reached the Channel coast on May 20th, they severed the Allied armies in Belgium from the rest of France. Approximately 1.7 million French soldiers, along with the British Expeditionary Force and Belgian units, were trapped in a shrinking pocket. The evacuation from Dunkirk between May 26th and June 4th rescued over 338,000 Allied troops, a logistical and moral achievement of immense significance. But for France, it was also a strategic catastrophe. The loss of these forces deprived the country of experienced troops and heavy equipment at the very moment when a second phase of the German offensive was beginning. The fall of France accelerated after Dunkirk. German forces regrouped and launched Fall Rot, the offensive against southern France, on June 5th. French units fought with determination in many sectors, particularly along the Somme and Aisne rivers, but they were exhausted, under-equipped, and increasingly leaderless. On June 14th, German troops entered Paris, declared an open city to avoid destruction. The government fled first to Tours, then to Bordeaux. Political divisions that had simmered for years now exploded into the open. Some leaders, including Reynaud, argued for continued resistance from North Africa. Others, led by Marshal Philippe Pétain, believed that further fighting would only bring unnecessary suffering. On June 16th, Reynaud resigned. Pétain became prime minister and requested an armistice. The agreement signed on June 22, 1940, divided France into an occupied zone and an unoccupied zone governed from Vichy. The French army was largely demobilized, its equipment seized or destroyed. Approximately 1.8 million French soldiers became prisoners of war, many remaining in captivity until 1945. The defeat was total, not only militarily, but psychologically. A nation that had emerged victorious in 1918 now faced occupation, collaboration, and civil division. France's collapse cannot be explained by cowardice or incompetence at the individual level. French soldiers fought and died in large numbers, suffering approximately 90,000 killed in 6 weeks of combat. The failure lay in a system shaped by past trauma, constrained by political instability, and unable to adapt to a new operational reality. The German victory was not simply a triumph of technology or numbers, but of doctrine, initiative, and tempo. Germany forced France to fight a war it had not prepared to fight, at a speed it could not match, in places it believed were secure. The consequences of 1940 extended far beyond the fall of France itself. The defeat reshaped European politics, enabled Germany's domination of the continent, and set the stage for the wider global conflict that followed. It also provoked a reckoning within France that would influence its military thinking for generations. The lessons drawn after the war emphasized flexibility, decentralized command, and the dangers of preparing exclusively for the last conflict.